Hi, my name is Brendan O'Rourke. This presentation is on a paper called Ireland's Austerity Addiction Challenges and Opportunities. This paper is by myself and Dr. John Hogan. Both of us are at the College of Business in Dublin Institute of Technology. This paper was prepared for the Austerity project, and the Austerity project receives funding from the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council. Alas, this funding was not enough to pay us good money or good cash, but it did provide for some monies for research assistance across the project and for travel, again at quite an austere level. So alas, we weren't jetting from continent to continent in first class, but it did provide money for the research. Okay, if you want to follow up on this presentation because you find it so much fun, or if you're completely put off this presentation and would prefer to just read the paper, you can get the paper either from the Austerity website, where it should be available shortly, or you can get it from the Dublin Institute of Technology repository of research papers. And both of those links are provided at the end of this slide, just here at the end of the slide. So if you go to either of those sites, you can get the full paper associated with this. This is an unusual paper for John and I think. Because it's more applied than we usually do, so it's much broader in scope than our normal academic papers are. And secondly, I suppose it's more normative or more political because we're advocating a way of, I suppose, proposing alternatives to austerity that many of us would like to see in the public debate. And in that sense, it's near advocacy, but also drawing on research. So it's not a purely scientific paper in that respect. Okay, I'll now turn off the camera so you can both see John's email address and his website directly above my head, are blocked by my head at the moment, and also you can concentrate on the slides for the next bit of the presentation. In this paper, we're going to use the metaphor of addiction for what state and relationship we have with austerity. This is not meant to belittle either the pain of addiction or indeed the pain of austerity, but we do think that kind of common sense ways of thinking about addiction are quite useful in thinking about austerity. So we hope that helps you. Ireland's addiction is to what we call post-liberal austerity, because there's been a history of austerity associated with classical Keynesian liberalism and neoliberalism that has kind of been problematic for Ireland. And now there's a new kind of variant of post-liberalism called order liberalism, which is the kind of liberalism that developed in Germany. This, in our view, is an old poison in Ireland and across the EU. This austerity and post-liberalism tied the millstone of bank bailouts around Ireland's neck, slashed its education and health spending, and meant its budget were closely supervised by the Troika of the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank. Unemployment spiked, and there was an exodus, particularly of young people from the country. This was a period of national humiliation as economic sovereignty evaporated in a deal described as being more akin to the Versailles Treaty than the Marshall Plan. Yet despite all this harm and the great effort it took to regain our sovereignty in 2013, Ireland is once again on a post-liberal high, with centre-right parties topping the poll, the national economy being celebrated once more as a triumph of neoliberalism, and soaring house prices being taken as a return of the good old times. Rising homelessness, prohibitive rents, the precarious nature of Ireland's competitive corporate tax position, and the bubble in land prices, while discussed, are more rationalised away than rationally dealt with. At the same time, local authorities administer austerity, they reduce property taxes. So all of us, not just we Irish, are back on the bottle again, and it's a poisonous bottle. The rest of the presentation, I'm going to look at some of the background that we share internationally and among those of us who have been looking for alternatives to austerity. We'll then look at Ireland's dependencies, Ireland's particular dependencies, I think, which may not be that different from anywhere else, but gives you an idea of where we're coming from, as well as briefing you on the Irish situation. We then look at a number of opportunities. First of all, an opportunity for us to build trust and trustworthiness with the public. Secondly, on how we can use framing to promote democratic discussion and alternatives, not to manipulate it. And thirdly, look at some divisions in post-liberalism that are both powerful but can be, I think, used to open up the debate before we conclude. Okay, our background, well, in this alt-austerity project, I think our background is summarised by the two books that have been produced, The Austerity State and Austerity, the Lived Experience. And of course, we have a wider background of people writing on austerity to choose from as well. In this section of the paper, we'll give our kind of take on what we've learned from it. So, first of all, despite what we perhaps hoped for after the 2008 crisis, where I think a lot of us hoped that the utter failure of neoliberalism would get rid of it as the dominant way of thinking and talking about the economy. Instead, what we've seen is, as Crouch puts it, the strange non-death of neoliberalism. We've also seen the revival of ordoliberalism, that's the post-liberalism that developed in Germany, and certainly the survival of the idea of that dangerous idea of the austere state that has been so well described by Bly and others. So in some ways, it's been a disappointing outcome of what was an awful crash, the 2008 crash. There isn't been that silver lining we thought there might be. However, we should recognize that post-liberalism is stressed and strained. Perhaps it's not brain dead. I think Peck has talked about zombie neoliberalism. But something we'll come back to, we think that maybe post-liberalism's heart, its passion, its life force is dead, even though there might be a lot of intellectual excitement still left in it. Post-liberalisms are not giving the same emotional satisfaction. And this is shown in the rise of nationalisms and nativisms of Trump, Brexit and Putin. It's shown in the progressive protest movements, which mightn't be very coherent, but show a lot of passion. And it's also shown in the decline of social democratic parties that essentially have seemingly bought into neoliberal ways of thinking and still are fighting as if neoliberalism is alive and well. The neoliberalism that is being revived is the neoliberalism of people like Trudeau, Macron, and in Ireland, Varadkar. And these neoliberals who have had electoral success in the case of Trudeau and Macron, but not yet in terms of Radker, I think rely on their novel features. These are handsome, attractive young men, youngish men for politicians anyway, with very interesting and intriguing life stories, and you know are charismatic in their own way. And it's their post-liberal features, their novel features, that I think is keeping them alive, keeping them public interested in them, rather than their neoliberalism per se. So they have to provide, if you like, a heart from elsewhere in order to govern. Post-liberalism is in trouble as well, because its compatibility with democracy is increasingly under strain. You know, in a way, the West took a big bet, as The Economist has put it, on China, hoping that some, you know, neoliberal markets, which China has adopted, would make China democratic. I think the same was one time hoped for in Russia. And yet these are now really neoliberal, at least in the case of China, and arguably in Russia's case as well, you know, dictatorships. This has been seen too in the Middle East, where the great hope of democratizing the Middle East seems to have failed, but neoliberalism continues. Some neoliberal thinkers, like Peter Thiel, for instance, have been quite honest in seeing democracy as putting their neoliberal freedom in danger. And I think from the other strand in post-liberalism that's dominant at the moment, order liberalism, I think there can be seen that we're now entering, I suppose, a period of diploma democracy, as one critic has called it, or a technocracy that isn't very amenable to democratic control. So post-liberalism is still dominant. I don't think we can say neoliberalism is anymore. I think maybe particularly in Europe there's more order liberalism. I think neoliberals to some extent have linked up with populists and authoritarians like Trump. But it doesn't really give the same kick as it did before. Post-liberalisms don't provide the excitement and the heart of I suppose, the energy behind what is needed in politics anymore. Its addicts either crave higher doses or include exotic additives. Okay, now to talk about Ireland's particular condition, or particular features of its post-neoliberal condition. First of all, I think we need to recognise that Ireland has been tied to liberalism and post-liberalism for quite some time, even before the establishment of the state. In a way, a little bit of local freedom has been used to govern Ireland for quite some time. You had the classical liberal period before the foundation of the state, and I would argue, and myself and John Hogan have argued elsewhere, that this continued, you know, nearly up to 1970. You then had a brief flirtation in Ireland with Keynesian new liberalism in the early 70s and arguably in the late 70s. And from 1981, you've had a really strong neoliberal strain in Irish politics, and that's continued right up to the crash. And then we've had a slightly different version of post-liberalism from 2008 in Ireland, I think, and that is order liberalism, which requires more active governance of markets from the state, and that's in the form of order liberalism, which of course was well developed in Germany and through the EU is being institutionalized in Ireland. So post-liberalism is deeply historically embedded in Ireland. Another feature of the Irish economy that I think is important is how Ireland is networked into the international system. It's an open market in trade terms, in labour terms, in investment terms. It's small and its culture is quite open as well. Its English-speaking nature means it's quite open to, I suppose, American influences. And, you know, if you look at the number of companies with real activity in Ireland and significant activity in Ireland, the number of multinational corporations that are based in Ireland or have significant activity in Ireland, it's huge for such a small country. This dependency on multinational corporations is very strong. It's been around since the late 1950s, and it's really hard to exaggerate how it dominates public policy and indeed the media. Keir Graham and I recently did a paper on, for instance, the very soft and long interview that the national broadcaster's main radio show, Morning Ireland, did with Tim Cook about how Ireland is fighting the European Commission's decision that Apple owes Ireland 13 billion. So it really is hard to exaggerate how dependent and how influential that foreign direct investment policy is in Ireland. I suppose before finishing with the idea of foreign direct investment, I would note that the low corporation tax isn't necessarily a core part of that strategy, even though it might appear that way in Irish public discussion at the moment. However, to move on to other features that we have looked at in this paper of the Irish post-liberal condition, is that Ireland is very much part of the EU, and in that sense, there's a constitutionalization, as some have put it, which might be a bit of a confusing term in Ireland, where the constitution is associated more with democracy than anything else. But what we mean by it, using that international term, is that there are more and more aspects of economic governance, if you like, built into the system, almost beyond public debate. So our membership of the Eurozone, for instance, gave up on the idea of a locally controlled democratic monetary policy. And not that Ireland was ever great at exercising that, so maybe that wasn't much of a loss. But you also see the institutionalization of things like the Irish Fiscal Council, which is a group of economic experts that advise on fiscal sustainability. They're mostly economists, so you can see the economist's view being given institutional power. There's also more formal budgetary processes in place in Ireland than there was before. Whether these help democracy or hinder it is another question, but you definitely see an increase in the power of economists with things like the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service since the crisis. We think that the current and most likely continuing scenario is that Ireland will be in a more integrated, ordo-liberalised Europe, but we wouldn't want to rule out in this time of great uncertainty the far-right threat to the EU, which has not gone away. And we clearly would like to see alternatives both to an order-liberalised Europe and to a far-right Europe. So we need to get working on alternatives. Now, one of the ways we can work on the alternatives, one of the opportunities is to build trust and trustworthiness. People are rightly cynical of manipulative media campaigns. But as the recent debate and revelations about Cambridge Analytics have shown, even the educated are remarkably vulnerable to being misled by the media, and especially new media. I think the educated are vulnerable too, whereas they're more and more cynical of traditional media, and maybe rightly so. Part of the reaction to that has been what's called the rise of the intellectual dark web. And that includes people that you might disagree with, and I certainly do, like Jordan Peterson. But I think the popularity of people like Peterson, I think, is a sign of something interesting and sign of an opportunity. Peterson, no matter what you think of him, requires, if you're not a social science expert, a bit of cognitive effort to engage with. Okay, he might be simplistic, you know, in my view, he's dressing up some particular view of Christianity that's quite old and dressing it up in a new sort of way, an interesting way that obviously a lot of people find intriguing. But no matter what you say about him, he's not simple. And it requires some cognitive effort and some cognitive capability and a willingness to expend effort to understand something. And I think that shows that the public, who are now quite educated, regardless of their level of formal education, I think a lot of them are very educated compared to publics in the past. And they're smart people, and they're willing to engage in some effort. But I think a fault that we've had on the left has been we've assumed as social science experts that everybody has the time to become a social science expert. And we kind of belittle people when they don't and don't seem to get the basic understanding that we have as experts. But the trouble is they don't have time. We need democratic discourse, but cannot expect everybody to be a specialist. And this means that we're depending more and more on different specialists. As we've seen in the last section, we now have more powerful economists in Ireland, for instance, than we did before. And we need, with the public, to demand more from these more powerful specialists. We need, I think, to, as Pluway et al.'s work has shown, to build more ties among alternative experts with alternative views. And that means we need to unpack our research a little. And we also need to make them and any social science expert more accountable for their increased institutional strength. So we need to provide trusted and trustworthy specialists in society and keep experts, including ourselves, ethical, honest, and in a public service ethos. I think progressives are in a good position to do that because we are genuinely interested in making the debate more democratic. And I think the public, when we make some effort to communicate with them in a respectful way, respectful of their intelligence, respectful of their efforts, and respectful too of their time, I think will allow us, afford us that opportunity to provide alternatives to them. One of the ways that I think we need to develop that conversation with the public is by developing more forthright and firm frames. Okay. And of course, I think most of us will be familiar with some work on frames. Frames are, well, a very good example of frames is the one given by Goffman, by Lakoff, who says we frame politics as a family. So our view of politics is based on which model of the family we find most interesting. I'm not sure I fully buy into Lakoff's elaboration of that concept, but I think it's a good explanation of a frame, which is a structured, and we certainly have a structured view of how a family works. It's familiar. I think we're all familiar, as the word implies, with family. It's emotionally charged. It matters to us, and it's morally salient. And as Lakoff points out, we use the idea of the family to habitually understand politics. So frames are those things, those metaphors usually that we use to understand something in a powerful and emotionally charged way, and an easy way. One of the things that frame theory generally has pointed out is that simply reacting to and criticizing another frame probably just strengthens that frame. Lakoff's famous example is, if you tell somebody not to think of an elephant, it's very hard for them to do anything but think of an elephant. Simply saying no austerity invokes the austerity frame. Being anti-austerity still gets people to think about austerity. And there's very good cognitive and discursive arguments for believing this idea that you can't simply criticize intellectually a frame and expect that frame to be undermined. You'll actually strengthen it unless you're very careful. So what I'm suggesting, and what we're suggesting in this paper, is that we use framing to enhance, not suppress, democratic discourse. So I'm not advocating that we use frames in a manipulative way. I'm not advocating that we particularly be secretive about our use of frames. But what we recognize is that for frames to be useful, they need to be available to people. And to be available for people to use, people need to be familiar with those frames. We can't just mention a frame once on a news program in an interview about austerity. We need to repeat those frames so that they become available to the public. So the kind of thing I'm talking about is that we take as many opportunities as we can to point out how something like the smartphone is, well, we have the smartphone because of publicly funded research. I'm not denying, and let's not deny, the genius of those of people who work in Apple or Steve Jobs as an entrepreneur. I'm not denying that genius at all, but we need to remind people that the technologies behind the smartphone, things like the Siri, the voice activation, that comes from a DARPA project financed by the US Army. When we talk about the internet, which is available through smartphones these days, that was developed, as we know, by public universities, and the World Wide Web is credited to the work which was made freely available to everybody at CERN. So we must remind people that innovation and progress, the public service activity and public research helps create that. And without publicly funded activity and public research, those smartphones wouldn't be there. We need to remind people that, yes, we need to think of tomorrow. We can't consume everything today, but we need to think of tomorrow and provide for tomorrow in terms of real investment, not financial savings. There's no point in sovereign wealth funds that are simply raided every time the state gets in trouble. We need real buildings, real investments in education that can't disappear when the financial markets take a downturn. We need to remind people that welfare should be for people, not for profits. That the kind of welfare available to corporations is ridiculously expensive, and the kind of welfare that's made available for people is under attack, and we need to, if we want people to be innovative and take risks and have the security to take risks in life, we need to provide welfare for people. Now, the there's a reference at the end of these slides and in the paper from Neon et al., who have applied Lakoff framing to the British economy, which is useful certainly for the Irish economy and for other economies, but it's not definitive. So we have a few more suggestions to make. For instance, throughout this presentation, we have been calling the ideology, the discourse, the strategy behind austerity, the kind of austerity we're seeing at the moment, as post-liberalism. I think that's important to frame it as post-liberalism because the freedom that classical liberalism promised essentially has failed. And liberalism realized this in 1900 and started to develop all sorts of new liberalism, neoliberalism, order liberalism, when it became clear that big corporations curtailed people's freedoms, could dominate markets, could buy elections, and where clearly the economy was going into crises that caused a lot of problems and needed government intervention to get it out of those crises. You know, the idea of classical liberalism delivering freedom without any help from the state or in a pure laissez-faire environment, you know, essentially every sensible social scientist, left or right, abandoned that idea after 1900 or so. So we need to recognize now that we're living in a post-liberal era, and we need to show that freedom needs to be more than liberal freedom. We need freedom to compete even if you're not a member of the elite. We need freedom not only from big government, but from big corporations. And that will involve some big government. We need freedom from paid-for politics. We need genuine democracy where money doesn't distort the democratic process. And we need freedom for citizens, not for corporations. We also, I think, can take advantage of the fact that so many people know their workplaces so well, and they know that those workplaces are being mismeasured, so those workplaces can be financialized. All across the economy, there's various measures being introduced into different people's activities, into different expert areas, which tries to reduce everything to a measurement that the market will like. And I think as we talk to people who are non-specialists and social scientists, they know about such mismeasurements. They mightn't realize how common it is. We know, and I think most people in Western economies know, how poor the measurement of credit rating agencies are, how they utterly failed in measuring the risk associated with, you know, expansion in mortgages to people who couldn't afford them and who would suffer from taking them out. We know that those credit rating agencies have failed, and that mismeasurement was forced, or at least facilitated and encouraged by a crazy financialization that's going on. We know too that educational performance indicators are pretty poor measures of where you should send your kid to school. And we know things like hospital rankings can be hugely distorted, or can hugely distort how good a hospital can be for you. And these distortions are on the measurements are forced by financialization. And I think we should remind people of that process and also ask them about how that process is in their particular area. It would be good social science to ask them, and it would also, I think, increase the conversation about alternatives. Another opportunity, I think, for those of us promoting alternatives is to avoid being caught by post-liberal tensions, but to take advantage of post-liberal tensions to promote conversations and promote alternatives. Neoliberals, you know, those who really emphasize the freedom of entrepreneurs and who really promote the myth of laissez-faire and absolute freedom, people like Thiel, and the kind of post-liberalism we associate with the Americans, and order liberals, those who recognize that for markets to work, we should have, in order liberal terms, we should have lots of regulations that promote market conforming rules. I think the first thing we need to do with the difference between those two is avoid recruitment into their debates. I think what post-liberal differences can often do is catch us in a pincer movement. You know, arguing whether or not there should be fiscal or monetary stimulus for the rich is not much progress, but it's the kind of argument that order liberals and neoliberals can get themselves in. I don't think we should get into those arguments. I think instead we should replace post-liberal frames as we divide and conquer. We should, like McBride and Whiteside have asked, every time austerity comes up, we should ask austerity for who? It seems a lot of people get paid a lot of money to, you know, suggest how austerity is done on others, or to manage the doing of it for others, or to set up corporations to abstract the state's capacity and democratic capacity to do things. We should call out neoliberal excess of the type that, for instance, Bertie Ahern and Charlie McCreevy engaged in, the ridiculous gifts to the rich that that government and other neoliberal governments gave. We should critique the commonalities, not with simply being anti whatever frame they're presenting, but with better frames. So, for instance, I think we should at times agree with neoliberals. We should say, yes, expert regulators and regulators can be elitist and need to be made democratically accountable and have a public service ethos. Of course, our frame is the democratically accountable and public service ethos, but I think we can agree that experts are often elitist. Yes, we should agree with neoliberals, more and more bureaucracy for lives. And then we should point to where private corporations have been doing that a lot. It's not just the government, it's private corporations are taking over our lives, and they should be controlled and made democratically accountable. Yes, we should agree with neoliberals that they're right, that immigrants are great for the economy. And therefore, we should argue they need investments in terms of education and protection from exploitation. And we should give them a legal status so there's no race to the bottom. We should agree with ordo liberals sometimes. We should agree with them when they're right. Yes, experts and regulators are valuable and need more resources, but they need to be democratically accountable and have a public service ethos. There's no point in just giving them more resources if they're going to do whatever they or the well-paid masters want them to do. Yes, we need to think of tomorrow. The order liberals are right on that. But that means we need to put real investment in education, public transport, science. We don't need to sell off state capacity. We don't need to spend extra cash to guarantee private sector rewards, as has been the case in a lot of private financial initiatives. Yes, there needs to be cutback, and we can save money by doing things directly through the state rather than with private sector initiatives. Okay, to conclude, in all of this paper, we've been trying to say a couple of things. We've tried to say that we can help break free from austerity addictions by exposing post-liberal failures and the pseudo-freedom of liberalism. We can unpack our research so as to build wider ties I think there has been a tendency among progressives to really embed our research, because we know how much the market, how much the economy is embedded in society generally and not just the market. And we've tended not to unpack our research, but I think we should, so we can build those wider ties among the network of people who are promoting alternatives. Very different alternatives sometimes, but alternatives. We should provide more useful frames. So we should talk about the need for the state to act to guarantee the individual's freedom, and for us to act to guarantee the state is democratic, or not to guarantee it, but actually to make it more democratic. And of course, above all, we need to keep social science specialists, especially ourselves, honest. And I think we're in a good position to do that. And we think that what we've proposed in our paper will certainly help doing that. Hopefully, you have found this useful, and of course we are interested in continuing the conversation and see this particular paper as part of that conversation. Thank you very much.